Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the STP training webinar series. Today we are hosting a panel discussion, the topic for which is communication in testing. Our esteemed panelists for the day are Angela Riggs, Damien Synodinos, and Jane Fraser. I'm Smita Mishra and a professional tester myself, and I'm so excited to host you all and Angela, Damien, and Jane on our STP webinars. A quick information for all of you. There is an upcoming webinar, AI Test Generation, what we have learned so far, on 8th of May. The speaker is a very well-respected one on AI, Kevin Suresh, who is also the CEO and CTO for Appfence.ai. The link is up for you to register, so please go for it. And if you are on Twitter, please share about this webinar with your followers and connections. You can also add STP's Twitter handle to your tweets, which is @SoftwareTestPro. You can also note down the speaker's Twitter handle, the speakers for today. Their Twitter handles are mentioned there, Jane C. Fraser, Angela Riggs, and there is an underscore right after her name. And then there is D. Synodinos. All right, let's get started with the webinar today. A very warm welcome, Angela, Damien, and Jane. We are very thrilled to have all three of you with us today. And let me quickly introduce you for all of us here. Jane Fraser, who's the test director at Onkai in INC. So Jane is a software and hardware test engineer, manager, with over 20 years of experience in various technologies, robotics, mobile games, online games, casual games, social networking games, website, QA, e-commerce, release management, desktop publishing, and word processing. Wow. She currently works at Onkai, which is a harnessing robotics and artificial intelligence, which is harnessing robotics and artificial intelligence to bring to life consumer products with an unprecedented level of intellect and interactive capabilities. Jane and her team help Onkai create consumer experiences using cutting-edge technology that was once confined to robotics labs and research institutes. She is also an independent certified coach, teacher, and speaker with the John Maxwell team. Welcome on board, Jane. Our next panelist is Angela Riggs. She is the quality assurance engineer at Vacasa. Angela believes that empathy and curiosity are driving forces of quality and enjoys solving a variety of challenges from this perspective. As a QA engineer at Vacasa, she works to understand and create quality experiences for the product, engineering teams, and the organization as a whole. Welcome on board, Angela. And finally, Damien. Sorry we had to do ladies before the gentlemen. So Damien is the founder and owner of Ineffable Solutions. He's been helping build better software and build software better for more than 25 years. Now through his company, which is Ineffable Solutions, Damien offers experience-based and research-hardened talks, trainings, and consulting that are educational and enjoyable. His experience spans many roles and companies in diverse industries, including airline, education, e-commerce, finance, insurance, retail, and commercial reality. Damien also helps organize an annual regional testing conference and frequently mentors, coaches, and advises IT professionals around the world. He's an international speaker and trainer presenting fundamental topics applicable to a wide range of contexts at numerous conferences and corporations. Additionally, Damien has over 10 years of theatrical improv experience and frequently uses applied improv to teach a variety of subjects, which I'm very aware of, Damien. I have seen you do that on stage at a conference. All right, so let's get started with the discussion. And very warm welcome again, Jane, Angela, and Damien. And let us start discussing how communication is changing in software testing and how one adapts and leads the conversation on teams and projects. And before I go ahead and get started with our questions on communication, I really want to hear from each of you, how does your daily work look like on a typical work day? What does Damien do? What does Angela do? What does Jane do at work? So we can get started with Jane.
Okay, my typical work day starts early in the morning, looking at what I have a team in Vietnam, so a lot of cross-country communication. also in China. So I start the morning is trying to figure out what they did overnight, which communication is a huge part of that, making sure we know what they've been doing. And basically that cycles throughout the day is getting information because our engineering team is in the US and being able to communicate that to the overseas team by the end of the day. So it's a lot of taking in all the questions and answers, mushing them back together again, and spitting out some more communication in the evening so we make sure we get the full cycle around, that everyone knows what they're doing and we don't end up with questions that don't get answered. So we don't want that extra 24-hour flow of unresponsiveness.
Wow. So you have a hugely distributed team and you work with them. Great.
Yeah.
How about you, Angela? How does your day look like?
My day can be widely varied. Part of what I do is backup release management for engineering teams that don't have a dedicated QA engineer, either semi-permanently or because their QA engineer is out of town or on vacation. A lot of what we're doing right now is focusing on building in security practices to both testing and development workflows. So finding the gaps of where that can be supported and how we can coach people on doing better security. Various troubleshooting happens a lot throughout the day, whether it's someone deploying or releasing something, or local environments, or local testing of different PRs. We're kind of a Jane of all trade in how the day goes. So it's always different, but always fun.
Super cool. Your day actually looks exciting to me. It's like unpredictable, probably almost every day. All right. So, Damien, how does your day look like at work?
Hi, Smita. Thanks for having me. Well, like Angela and Jane, my day varies. As I've moved my focus towards professional speaking, oftentimes a typical day will be sitting in my office, researching, learning, and developing new content, learning more about some topic that's interesting to me, and I see applications in the professional world that I think others will be interested in as well. Another typical day is taking that content and presenting, sometimes at conferences around the world, sometimes at corporate training, sometimes at workshops, where I'm in front of folks using my voice and communicating, trying to take what's in my head and transfer it to theirs. And then sometimes another typical day is if I'm doing a consulting job, and those vary widely. Obviously, there's a lot of testing, but I also have recently done some BA work, elicitation, requirements gathering. I've done some onboarding documentation. I've done some interviewing. So again, like Jane and Angela, my typical day is quite varied professionally.
Mm-hmm. So, super. I know that you are into consulting now, but I can actually imagine your day doing improv and then teaching people all of that. It's I wish I could be one of your clients.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So coming to the topic and discussing more on communication, let me start with the very, very basic essence of it as to what is communication and why are we discussing it here? Like, why is it important to be discussed? What's its role and why is it important for us to, have a discussion over it and probably even understand communication skills? So I'll let Angela start with it. Like, what is communication as per you, and why do you think it's important?
Sure. So I think at a high level, communication is how you create shared understandings of either what your needs are or what you think someone else needs. And it's hard. It's not necessarily an innate skill that either you have or you don't. There are certain methods of communicating that are better than others, and it is possible to learn and improve. One of the reasons it's important is because communication happens all the time, whether you intend it to or not. So if it's something that you're mindful about and thoughtful about and do purposefully, it means that you're able to be better at getting your message across, at being understood, but also at understanding when other people are communicating to you. Communication is JIRA tickets, it's pull requests, it's release workflows. It happens all the time in different ways. And all of those ways happen at various points throughout the day and are an everyday part of your role in your job.
Yep. Jane, you want to add to that?
Sure. Yeah, I find like a lot of being a tester is most of what we're trying to do is communicate what we want fixed. A lot of our day is spent finding issues, and hopefully the engineers are communicating well to us so we know where to look. But really making sure that those, the bugs that we submit don't end up, that we communicate them well enough so we don't go, well, it works on my machine, our tester's favorite phrase, but really trying to make sure that our bug reports are communicated well, whether that's with, making sure they, you have videos of it is a lot of what we do with ours because we have a physical robot, a lot of our logs, but just making sure that we're very clear in our JIRA communication, which is one of our largest communication groups with us, so that there is a fast turnaround and not a lot of I don't understand, which really slows down the whole process.
Yep. So, and Damien, tell me, what is communication to you and why do you think it's important?
I'll add a little bit, sure, building on their ideas. I think that communication is simply put, moving ideas with words, transferring and exchanging ideas. And all of us intake information and knowledge all the time, and it exists in our head, and we use conceptual abstract models to make sense of it. And we may understand it well in our head, we may understand it not as well, and that's all fine and good. But if we want to try and get those same ideas that are in our head to other people's heads, we use communication, various forms of verbal, written, body language, tone, all these different ways that we communicate these ideas and move these ideas from one head to another. As Angela said, oftentimes communication are lumped into this idea of soft skills, but soft skills are actually very difficult. They're very hard. It's one of those things you can learn a lot of skills, but communication is something that is more difficult to learn. When you're communicating, there's intent, there's interpretation. And as a tester, it's very important to understand communication, because as we intake knowledge and intake information about the product, about quality, about risk, no matter how well we understand it, we have to communicate and move and transfer those ideas to other people, and that we use communication to do it. So it's essential to being a tester.
Yeah, actually, very well said, Damien. And you actually led me to my next question I had in my mind was, so since we all panelists and myself and the audience mostly belongs to the testing background, and I keep hearing the terms bug reports and communication, back to the development team or forward to the production team. So when I hear all these terms, I'm tempted to think that communication is a very critical skill for testers. So, Damien, do you think that yes, it is critical, but it is just as critical as it is to everybody, or do you think it's more critical for a tester?
I think that communication is an essential skill to any living person, honestly. I think it's a very important thing for anyone to become adept at, to become very capable with. No matter what, if you're a plumber, an architect, a circus performer, a tester, you're communicating in some way, shape, or form with other people. You're moving ideas. Now, certainly it's a continuum. It's not binary, and some professions need communication more than others, and I think the testing is one of those. Because a lot of what we do is not just intaking information, it's also providing information. We're purveyors of information. That's our product, that's our service. We provide information to folks that matter about things that are important and relevant and useful. And so in that regard, I think that communication is especially important for testers.
Yeah, Angela, how about you? Do you think also that communication is certainly a very critical skill for tester, or to the point where tester might actually fail if they don't have enough or they have poor communication skills?
Sure. So I do think, to Damien's point, that it is an important skill for everybody, right? Like a car mechanic has to be able to communicate to a layperson what's wrong with the car so that person can make a decision about whether to pay for the fix or not. I do think that within development environments, the responsibility of communication, and especially facilitating communication between other people, often falls to testers. And I think for that reason, while it is a critical skill for everybody, I think it's often also a critical part of the tester role, because they are often counted on to communicate, between developers and product managers and users and, the business side. So I think it's important for everybody, but perhaps slightly more so for testers, if only because the weight of having to do so is often attributed to that role.
Mm-hmm. And Jane, what do you think about the same?
Yeah, I agree with the all the comments. Yes, it's a skill set I think everyone really needs to have, and it kind of the better your communication, the wider you can have a career. For testing is because it is the flow of information. We're looking at trying to learn from the developers of what what you're testing, but then being able to clearly tell them what's wrong and that they can fix it quickly is a skill that will get you a lot higher up in the organization than if you're not clearly communicating and there's a lot of traction back and forth going, I don't know what you meant by this. Is this, if your reports aren't clear or if you can't explain to the developer what you're seeing clearly, you're not going to be as good a tester as one that has that clear communication.
Yep, yes. In fact, it's I was just listening to you all, and our friend Jim Hazen happens to be on the show. It appears he's attending it. I'm sorry, Jim, you're not on the panel, but I should have put you too. But he has a very interesting point to add. He's saying communication skills are one of the top ones a tester needs to have. As part of that is listening skills. Testers need to realize they are the hub of the communication wheel with other groups on the outer rim. A lot of information flows in and out of the testing group. Thank you, Jim, for adding your point. And this is pretty much like almost all three of the panelists did mention the same. So thank you so much. But to that point, let me begin with Angela. To the point, Angela, that Jim is making, that communication skills are one of the top ones for tester, and that includes listening. What do you think are different types of communication? Like, what are the different ways to communicate? And I'll come to Damien right after that.
There's so many ways to communicate. It could be written, and written could look different depending on whether it's an email or it's in Slack or it's on a pull request. Verbal communication, absolutely. I think verbal communication is also not only what you say, but how you say it. And then going back to James's point a little bit, it's also when you're talking about verbal communication, it's how you listen. It's how you pay attention when someone else is talking and how you receive that information and how you are able to use it and show that you understood what was happening and what their needs are or what the outcome needs to be. Body language is a way of communication. Are you on your phone? Are you looking out the window? Are you making eye contact with the person who's speaking? When you're speaking, are you making sure to make eye contact with everyone else in the room to show that you're aware that they're participants, even if you're the one currently speaking?
Mm-hmm. True. Damien, you want to add to that?
Sure.
As to what are the different types of communication? Yeah.
My answer begins the same way, same way as the last one. There's so many ways to communicate. A quote I like is from American-Austrian psychologist, communications theorist Paul Watzlawick. He says that one cannot not communicate. I really like that quote. He goes on to say that once proximity has formed awareness between living creatures, they begin interpreting any signals received. It's verbal and written are often the two ways that we commonly think about communicating ideas, moving ideas between heads and minds. But there's so many different ways. There's acting is one way that I do on stage as an improviser. I'm using my body and using my body language, using facial expressions, the tone, the speed, the pitch of my voice to communicate things that are not in the message itself. As an artist, sometimes artists communicate through sculpting or painting or cartoons, and there's no words at all. It's just an image that somebody looks at and they feel a certain way, and you're communicating an idea. So there's all sorts of different ways that we communicate. And the more that testers understand and master these different ways, the better they'll be able to move their idea into someone else's head, communicate their thoughts.
Mm-hmm. True. In fact, I saw you tweet about that quote today, and I was like, okay, Damien is already in the groove. So he's already
That's
thinking
right,
about
yes.
communication. Yeah, good. Jane, so what do you think if there are more types of communication, or what are the different types?
I agree. Like we've gone over a lot of the different types. One of the things is really, again, is that between communication is a two-way street. You need to both listen and I guess project or tell your side of the story. But one of them is to really making sure that you're actually seeing the other person's point of view and your point of view. I have one cartoon which is two people standing on the opposite side of a number, and it looks like a 9 from one side and a 6 from the other. Both sides are right, but both don't agree with each other. And being able to stop and maybe walk around and see the other person's point of view, to really make sure you understand, and you're not just not believing them and trying to, getting into more confrontational. You really have to sort of like, wait a minute, why don't I understand what you're saying? Let's, have more of a, clear up the misconception and try and get on the same page.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Angela, did I hear you say empathy today, or did I just miss it?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Did I hear you say empathy today? I remember having this discussion last time with you, and you mentioned empathy is very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Empathy is absolutely an important part of communicating. I think it goes back to the point that Jane just made a little bit about being able to see someone else's perspective. You have to have empathy in order to understand and anticipate a little bit, how will your communication be received? What's likely to be a blocker, or what's likely to get potentially miscommunicated or need clarification? Depending on the message that you are communicating, what are reactions likely to be, and how can you help mitigate that in advance by offering appropriate information for your audience? And like communication, empathy is absolutely something that is a learned skill. There are people who are better at it, but it's not one of those you have it or you don't talents. It's something that can be taught and can be learned throughout your whole life. Ideally, you improve on it all the time. But I think it is a vital part of effective and productive communication.
Mm-hmm. And before I go ahead to the next conversation, Damien, I'm going to hold you to the word semantics. I'm sorry if you did mention it, but I might have overheard or not heard about it, because I was in my mind thinking about, yeah, there is verbal communication, there is written communication, then there is non-written, non-verbal, just communication while you're present in the room with a lot of your own presence. So we can have a further discussion on that later, but definitely want to hear this word semantics from you. What do you think about semantics with respect to communication skill?
Sure. One definition of semantics is roughly very similar to a definition of meaning. Semantics, one definition is the basic meaning, the glue that holds a word to some greater idea. Semantics is understanding meaning. And when Angela was talking about empathy, that's a big part of it. There's another fun quote. John Ralston Saul, Canadian philosopher, says that dictionaries are opinions expressed as truth in alphabetical order. Now it's a silly little quote, but there's also some truth to it, in that there is no singular definition for a word. There's common usage, there's common understanding. As Jane pointed out with her 6 versus 9 cartoon, people may understand the same thing in different ways. Another thing that gave me some insight into this was the interaction model by Virginia Satir. And with any time you're communicating something, there's a message that exists in your head, and you're the sender, and you encode it using different words or tones, and you send it through some channel, and there's noise that affects that message, which, by the way, Angela just said, sorry, can you repeat that, when she didn't hear. So there was some type of noise that interfered with the delivery of your message. So she used a communication technique, asking you to repeat the question to enhance communication. And then the receiver gets it and they decode it. And even if all of that goes rather well, Virginia Satir's interaction model talks about that we still can't control the interpretation of the message. Once the recipient intakes that, there's They apply meaning and significance and acceptance to it based on their past experience, based on their particular understanding. And we can't control any of that. And that's where empathy comes in. And all of this is a semantic conversation, understanding the meaning of different words, phrases, and ideas from different perspectives. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. And
That's
the
my
reason I
understanding of it.
thank you so much. The reason I did want to bring up these terms because Angela very passionately described empathy and communication as being very important last time, and you definitely, Damien, described semantics. And I wanted testers here to definitely hear these words because these are very critical, and especially when we have those debates about is this a test case, or test script, or test scenario, or whatever. Semantics are important. It is very important as to what your team understands with what particular definition, what particular label, what particular title, what words you're using and what they mean. Even if they are different from the outer world, at least the teams should definitely be in sync, those who are working together. Yeah. All right. Okay, Jane. I see a lot of robotics and a lot of automation around your work and artificial intelligence. So I am tempted to ask you this question is to, like, if I was a tester in your team, so how can I, or any tester in your team, how can they actually show their value of their work or their testing without having to describe it in terms of numbers of pre-scripted test cases or test execution, number of test execution, and all of these? Without using those numbers, how can they communicate to you how much of work they have done and how good or bad it is? How do you take that?
That's a tough way to answer that one. Yeah, a lot is communication on different fronts of just a lot of our testers that I have are very empathetic to our customers and basically a very customer focused look at our products and making sure that whatever we deliver, the customers are happy, and basically in a lot of cases with ours, enchanted with our robots. They have a lot of emotion, and making sure, one of the things is it's a very hard thing to test a robot's emotion, and saying he is the right level of happy or sad, that he's reacting to the user in the proper way. And which requires a fair bit of really good communication, not only saying like, well, he shouldn't have been sad at this point, but really trying to be able to explain and get the right, be able to tune the AI correctly so that the emotions coming from the robot are correct, that his feelings towards you go, as a friend, or as, he gets upset with you in the right percentage.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And Angela, in your team, how can a tester actually show the value of their testing without having to describe it in terms of, let's say, number of test scripts they ran or created?
In part of, I think, what engineering teams consider successful for a tester is the release cadence of how often new features are getting released into production. I think also in part, if we're starting to track escaped defects, looking at that number reducing is also a great way to show how a tester is being successful. In part because perhaps the tester is catching something before it hits production, but ideally also advocating and communicating back to their engineering team so that everyone is more vigilant about those escape defects getting out and helping to reduce that. Documentation is definitely a big one. I know all of the engineers that I know really, really appreciate documentation, but never really have time to write it. And so when a tester or someone writes documentation for either a feature or for a process or for user documentation, and it's something that the engineer team can use and propagate, that is immensely valuable, which again goes back to communication in the written form, of course. Really just being able to streamline the team's process and workflows and make the development lifecycle easy and simple and better for teams is a good way to show value? Are we reducing the churn that happens in the day-to-day and making it easier for engineers to get their work from in progress to deployed?
Thanks, Angela.
Yeah.
So, Damien, what do you think? Like, how can a tester actually show their values without? I mean, Angela gave us a lot of insights into how her team could actually do it, but how does a typical tester show their value without using numbers?
Sure. Well, as I said before, I believe that testers, the thing that they provide, the product or service, is actually information. And although we can label pieces of information as a feature, something that's desired, a green check mark, or we can label certain information as a bug, a red X, a thumbs down, something that's undesired, really, we can, perhaps explain why we believe it's a feature or a bug or something that's desired or undesired. But from another perspective, somebody standing on the other side of the 6 or 9, they may see it differently. They may see what we call a bug and label a bug as a feature. And so I really think the testers provide information. And when I'm testing something, I try to remember to provide 3 pieces of information: what I did, how I did it, and the results of the things that I did. And I consider the audience, or the audiences, the people that might be receiving my information, and I try and provide those 3 things: what I did, how I did it, and the results of what I did, in words and terms that are relevant and important and matter to those different people, those different audiences. There's a thought experiment I sometimes do where I ask testers, imagine you tested something very, very thoroughly using all the different techniques and approaches that you have in your tool belt, and you found no bugs, you found no problems, information that you label and perceive as a problem. Do you feel inadequate? Do you feel that you failed? Did you provide value? And oftentimes the answers that I get are, I provided no value and I feel inadequate as a tester. I was unable to find bugs, information labeled as bugs. And I would challenge that idea because, again, as information providers, if you're telling someone that matters in words that are relevant and useful to them what you did and how you did it and the results of what you did, even if it's all green check marks and desired results in their perspective, that is valuable. That's information that they didn't have before, and that information will allow them to make more educated, informed decisions. So even if you're a tester and you're not finding bugs, you're not finding information that you or someone else might perceive as bad, you are still providing a lot of value by providing information that didn't exist before. And one more thing that might be related to this is the idea of epistemic modality, which is a fancy way of another word for this is safety language. It's providing information, describing something using terms that also build in your sense of confidence into the thing that you're presenting. The example I sometimes use is, "It is raining," is a very definitive statement. It leaves no question for doubt. I'm telling you that it is raining. With epistemic modality or safety language, you might say, "It appears to me from where I'm sitting that it looks like it's raining." Now, I'm essentially saying the same thing, but I'm building in some sense of confidence. If I was sitting somewhere else, it might not appear to be raining. Now, that's a silly example, but if you bring it over to the testing context, saying something like, "This is a bug," is very different than, "From my test that I ran, this is the test that I ran, this is how I ran it, these are the results of my test, it appears to me that this might be a bug." That's using safety language, building in the confidence that you have in this information. It allows other people to understand better what you're trying to communicate.
Yep, and I want to come back to the safety language thing and the bug report thing, but before we move on to the next question, Jane, do you think your team does anything different than what Angela and Damien just mentioned about, how the testers show their value?
I think we're very similar. A lot, it's along the lines of, understanding, communicating with the engineers to know, what they're doing, providing a lot of documentation on how things work, especially with test teams overseas. We need a lot of documentation so that we don't have to be up till midnight every night, and just sort of keeping that flow of communication so that the work can get done and we can, just along his line on feeling more confident about, understanding what we know. And a lot of it is with how I try and perceive with our testers as we do things. We don't try and say, this is, this release shouldn't go or not go. Here's what we know about it. Do you really want us? This is what the customer will see. do you want the customer to see this? And I like to have a real customer-centric view on our communication. Not just this is the bug, this is how the customer is going to see it. Do you want them to see it this way?
Wow, that's a very interesting point, having customer-centric communication. Wow, so that's an interesting point here. All right, so moving on, Damien just mentioned the word safety language, and he was talking about number of bugs and kind of when you find the bug, how you mention it and with what confidence you're informing the team. I was having this thought while he was mentioning that once you have a product, or once you have a even a requirements documents, or at some stage of project development, once you are there and testers are kind of testing the product, or uh, they are into the team, and if once you have I mean, in totality, once you are actually doing the execution and you have bugs, you are able to you understand, you are at least able to imagine what we're talking about with respect to communication, that okay, this is how you have to mention the risks, these are the bugs, and you have to talk about them. But a lot of our testers do struggle with the whole shift left theory. Like, testers need to be involved from the start, and they have to be part of requirements discussion and planning and all of it. Keeping that in mind, uh, how do you think testers can assert their presence in the early part of the life cycle, and what should they be communicating so that once you are into the execution, like I said, bugs and risks and defects are what we are talking about, and we could talk about the same things early in too, but how do you think one should communicate earlier so that they are given more seat on the table earlier in the life cycle? uh, Angela, you want to start with it?
Sure. So I know shift left is probably kind of a buzzword these days, but I think in spite of that, it is definitely a useful concept to think about and implement in engineering and tech. One of the great ways I think to be involved early is in like the discovery or architecture planning, because part of testing is how easy is it to test. And oftentimes the product or application can be built in such a way as to make it much easier to test down the line when it's actually built, instead of having to do twice as much work because it's not easily testable, or to redo the work in order to make it easier testable after that's been discovered during the final product. During design, it's helpful to be communicating with your UX and your designers to look at how they're designing user workflows, or how they're designing, if it's someone designing the database system, how that's happening, so that you can prepare in advance for what you'll need to focus on when it starts getting built. So you know where the higher risk areas are, what would be potentially good to automate down the line because it's going to be repetitive and your time will be better spent on other things. It's also about communication. If you're earlier talking with product and with designers and with architects, it means that they're also potentially thinking about testing, and their work will support better testing procedures, but also just better practices around quality potentially, because you're having those conversations with them and bringing your perspective into the thing that they're designing or building.
Mm-hmm. Great. And I do agree with you on that hugely, Angela, that we do have to have testers early in this life cycle, and definitely things like usability, performance, security could actually greatly benefit from having testers onboarded much early, and otherwise too, I mean, functionally too. So Jane, I want to come to you. How do testers in your, or maybe if they don't do it right now, then how do you suggest them to communicate with the teams since this early part of the life cycle, so that they're much respected and they are able to add value?
Yes, we definitely are fairly involved early, more so that I've gotten involved earlier and earlier as my career has gone along. And a lot we try and do is looking at the requirements, is testing the requirements and making sure they're clear. making sure they don't conflict with another part of the product. Sort of along the line of integration testing. A lot of cases, engineers are, in one silo or another silo and don't really think about when their code hits each other, and making sure we don't have conflicts. We really look at the user stories and make sure they're complete, or do we need more so we can add value, as like, shouldn't we have a user story that says this? Determining what kind of tools need to be built before the product is ready to test, so that we're ready to go and not like at the last minute going like, oh, tool would have really worked well here. And determining what the goal is and really trying to get out is like, what's done? When is this, like, what is the goal for this feature? How is it going to make, how do we know that it's a good feature when we're finished? So that we have things to test against. And those have really helped us, and I think helped the team to kind of, like, oh, I guess we shouldn't do this. And one other value I think we bring to it is a lot of cases we have, a longer history across the product, and, well, remember when we did that? We might not want to do that again. And just sort of making sure we're not going down, the wrong way on a street again.
That's so beautifully told, Jane, actually. Yeah, because especially this historical part, that's where testers with a lot of product information are so useful, because they are able to guide the whole team with it, and having relevant experience definitely helps in communicating it better.
Yeah, in a lot of cases, just to add on that with the history too, is saying like, if you just adjust it this way, it'll be like, a lot faster to test. If you like narrow the scope a little bit here, we can test a lot faster and produce faster, as opposed to, this is going to take us forever, or we may never be able to test most of it. Being able to kind of direct the project a little bit, that it's, a tighter coding and easier to test.
Definitely, yes. All right, Damien, you want to add something there as to how testers can assert their presence in the early part of the life cycle? And what should they be
Certainly.
communicating? Yeah.
So you're talking about this idea, this, as Angela said, this buzzword, shifting left, earlier involvement of testers in the testing of software. So we're talking about software testing, keyword software. I think that all software begins as an idea. All software is an abstract idea made manifest as little pieces of electricity and bits and bytes zipping around in a computer or some device, and presented to us as pixels on a screen, and we're interacting with it, and it does things, and there's features and functions, and we interact with it with the keyboard and the mouse and gestures. And certainly as software testers, we can examine and explore and experiment with those different things. But before it became a manifest piece of software and electricity and bits and bytes, it was written down perhaps on a piece of paper as specifications or requirements. That was a lower level abstraction of this piece of software, where people took this idea and they wrote it down. And before it was on a piece of paper or in a document as specifications or requirements or things that the software shall be or do, it existed in someone's head. And certainly, if you're talking about software testing, it doesn't necessarily mean just interacting with a piece of software. It means interacting with all different forms of that software, all different abstractions. A tester can help test software when it's just an idea. If they're involved early, when the people are considering the idea of this piece of software, a tester can challenge and question those ideas. When those ideas are then made manifest as a requirement or a specification, testers can test those abstract ideas on paper and say, does this make sense? Is there a problem here? And finally, when those ideas on paper or a document are made into software and code, they can, of course, interact with the software at another abstraction level and test, as we all know we do software testing. But having testers involved early is useful because, again, back to Jane's wonderful example of the people on different sides of the 6 and the 9, testers provide a point of view that might be blind to others. Anyone that's thinking about a software application, an idea, when it's just an abstract idea being bandied about, those people might have agendas, they might have motives or reasons, they might have biases that they're unaware, they're blind of. Well, testers have a specific mindset. They're trained to challenge, to question, to explore these things. And if you can explore those ideas before they become requirements or specifications, if you can explore those requirements or specifications before they become code, you can potentially tease out and provide information that's useful to people before it ever becomes code. So I think that having testers involved early is very, very useful because they can test software in all of its different forms and manifestations, as an idea, as requirements, or as software itself.
Wow. So beautifully said, Damien. Thank you so
Thank you.
much. And yes, and thank you, Jane. I really liked your example too. And thank you, Angela, for putting all these things together. Now, before I move on to the audience questions, I mean the attendees questions, I want to ask you one more question which has like two parts. So one is, if you have ever faced any personal challenge in communicating, and of course we all have, but if there is any top that one that you can think of and you want to share quickly as to, with either with your customer, with a senior manager, with a team member, with a peer, anybody, challenge in communicating, and how you could probably try again and again and yet not be able to do it. And secondly, the second part of it would be if you have any tips on how one could improve their communication skills. How do they become excellent at communication, especially for testers? So if you could answer me these two parts together. Damien, I'll let you go first.
Thanks, Smita. Could you repeat the first part of the question? Could you rephrase it?
Yes, it's any of your challenges, your personal challenges at work. I mean, challenges that you faced personally at work with respect to communication, whether it was communicating with client or peer or manager, senior team, with your own team members, any of them.
Okay, the first thing that pops into my head with regards to that is oftentimes I'm trying to, for lack of a better term, sell my idea that the things that I teach and train and speak on are important. And that is to some degree persuading, selling an idea to someone that they may have some idea that it's true or they may not. So sometimes that's challenging, getting people to understand that communication is very, very important. Again, that idea that soft skills are easy is very common and widespread. So trying to sell that idea that communication is essential. It's tools and technology and approaches and techniques are all certainly important, but without a solid foundation, they're built on a foundation of sand. And that's why communication is so important. It's not necessarily cool or exciting to learn about something like communication for a lot of people. They'd rather learn the new hot thing out there. But sometimes that can be challenging. So the second part of your question, I think, was some different techniques or approaches that can help with communication. Back to a phrase, I think, is that correct?
Yes. How? What would be your suggestion so that one could actually improve on their communication?
To use a phrase that Angela said earlier, there's so many ways. A few I'll bring up are ones that I really like is metaphors and analogies. Sometimes if I'm trying to sell an idea, for example, and what I was talking about, sell an idea that communication is important to someone, and I don't think that they're understanding, I'm unable to sufficiently or adequately get the idea that's in my head into theirs, sometimes I'll try using metaphors or analogies. I'll find out some area or some context that they are very familiar with. Maybe it's skiing or cooking, or they're a parent, or they're into improv. And if I'm familiar with that context, I'll try and explain my idea in those different terms in a different context. And sometimes if I can explain, for example, the importance of communication, they're not understanding it, but they're a great cook. I'll say, oh, okay, you're into cooking. Well, do you use recipes? And do you go off recipe? I may say, well, communication is very important. It's like cooking. And I may use a metaphor, an analogy of cooking. And then they understand that. They say, oh, I certainly understand that. I say, well, if you understand that, let's just transfer that idea back to the first context. So sometimes metaphors and analogies can be very useful. Other methods, I just used one right now. I asked you to rephrase or paraphrase your question, to use different words, say the same thing with different words so that I better understand it. I think Angela used one earlier, which she said, could you repeat the question? Because there was noise interfering and she didn't quite hear it. Sometimes you can draw. Sometimes asking is one of the ways that I recommend people. Just ask. Sometimes there's social norms that prevent people from simply asking because they might feel embarrassed, or it's a group setting and they don't want to appear a certain way, appear stupid. So they are afraid to ask. And I would suggest that asking is one of the most effective ways at clearing up miscommunication. So there's just a few ways that, of the many, many ways that you might use to help reduce miscommunication.
It already sounded like a list coming out of an encyclopedia, like one after another. So many. I totally believe there are so many ways. So
Those
Angela,
come
you want
from
to?
a those come
Yeah.
from a workshop I do specifically on communication. And there's so many
Nice.
ways, and I briefly talk about a lot of different ways to try and give people new tools for their tool belt to help reduce miscommunication, or perhaps strengthen, make more robust existing tools so that they're able to use them more effectively. But there
So
are
you,
so many different ways that we can use to become better communicators.
awesome. And you do this workshop for testers. I mean, as for organizations also. Like if I wanted it for my organization.
It can be for testers, but it's not for testers. It is a
Oh,
communication workshop that's applicable, again, to circus performers, plumbers, architects, BAs, and testers. It's really helping people better understand moving ideas with words.
very well. So it could be across organization.
Yes.
Very nice. All right, Angela, you want to share with us any personal challenge that you faced with respect to communication, and any tips you have, any hints or any advice you want to give to testers for improving their communication?
Totally. For myself, so a lot of what I do in my job, I kind of talked about it before, is either advocate for or support different like quality practices and processes throughout the company and the engineering department. So when I'm doing this, one thing that I tend to do is get very excited about the thing I want to try out. And so I always tend to start by talking about why I think it's great and why I think it's a good thing to do. But what I need to do is present it from the point of view of how it benefits my audience, whether it's the people who are deciding that this will be implemented or the people who are going to have to do it once it becomes a process. I need to describe it as how it helps them do their jobs better, why they should care about it, potentially even communicating how it helps me do my job better, so they know that there's a reason behind it, like giving the why. Is super important to the majority of interactions that you have with people. I think it kind of goes back to a lot of what we said about like empathy, is let people know why you're doing a thing or why you're asking them to do a thing, so you can get their buy-in and create that understanding of the process or practice that I'm trying to introduce. As far as improving communication, I think part of it is kind of that reflection and mindfulness about where your gaps are. I think self-education is a big thing. I love Laura Hogan, has some great blog posts on communication and how she communicates with like her executives and with people that report to her. I think teaching something is a good way to practice improving communication. Giving a short presentation, writing a blog post. I think Damien mentioned how communication takes on more than one form. So like drawing diagrams of something is a really good way to like see how you understand something and whether you can pass on that knowledge to somebody else, and asking for feedback. It's always okay to ask someone, you know, am I stating this clearly? Would you like me to rephrase? Is there a different way that I could present this to you to communicate better?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Angela, for the insights. And Jane, do you want to share your challenge and some one of the challenge and some tips for the testers to improve their communication?
Sure. When you asked the question, I flashed back to very, very early. I think it was the third week into my career as a tester. I was testing Ventura Publisher, which is a desktop publishing program. And when I was importing graphics, they were really slow. I used to be a desktop publisher before this, so it was like testing a product that I used to use. And I logged a bug, basically saying the import of the graphics was too slow. And it got closed, will not fixed, it's okay. And I'm like, And it was one of those, it was like going, oh, how do I say this a different way? And realized, from a conversation my boss was having, like he was doing a presentation on, where they wanted to position the product, and he was comparing it to the other publishing programs, and I was like, oh. So I went back and I timed the import compared to all our competitors. and then push the bug back up, basically it was a difference of about 30 seconds in the import, which is, for speed of publishing was bad. And it was instantaneously a ship blocker. And really made me understand is you have to know your audience. As I find like talking with an engineer is, being technical and trying to get the technical pieces of it. If it's a UI UX is, thinking about the user and explaining how the user feels about it. The two different audiences and really trying to figure out how to tell the story that they will understand. I later read a book, Tell It to Win by Peter Guber, who was very big on figuring out how to tell your story. And making sure that story is being told to the right person. Like talking to an accountant and you're talking about colors, he's not going to care. But if it's a money conversation, money should be at the top point when you're talking to finance or the accountant, not, like, oh, this might be this, but really knowing who the audience is, like with your engineers or UX, is designing and telling it the right way. Learned it very quickly that you really have to. It's not just it was too slow, but that wasn't enough to make them feel that it was important.
Wow, that's actually very important, Jane, to actually know who you're talking to, so that you know what you are, how you should be presenting what you're talking. So great input, and I definitely could relate with your story on graphics import being slow. That's like something very, very close to something that I have been through. So interesting. Well, all of your stories are so exciting, and so thank you, Jane, Angela, and Damien. This was such an insightful session on communication on missions, and I can just start with one of the speakers, and I would suggest if all three of you could chime in, because the questions haven't really come into for any specific speaker. So as you want to chip in and discuss and bring up, will be good. We'll just have, since we have only a few minutes, we'll quickly get started with one and just have 2-3 more going. So the first question here comes from Lisa Crispin. Okay, thank you, Lisa, for attending. And she says, such important points here about how central communication is to a team's success. But do we see software team members being sent for communication training or learning new ways to collaborate, example, pairing or mobbing, etc., as often as they are sent to, say, a test automation training course? Why does the software profession keep emphasizing technical skill training when we know communication is central? Who wants to start?
I have a thought on that.
Yes, I knew. Okay.
In part, I think technical and also like technical skills versus the quote unquote soft skills. And I'll just use soft skills because we all know what it means, even though we all may not agree with that designation of them. But I think it's often assumed that technical skills can be learned and improved upon, but soft skills are innate, right? You either are good at communication or you're not. You're either good at writing or you're not. You're good at empathy or you're not. So a lot of businesses don't see the value of sending someone to a conference or a workshop to improve something that they don't necessarily think can be improved. And it's also harder to see a return on it, right? Someone goes to a technical workshop and they immediately come back and can implement a new type of testing framework. That's easily measurable of why it was worth the time and money. But if someone goes to a workshop about improving communication, that's a more gradual improvement and harder to pinpoint for visibility to say, this was worth the effort and time of going to that.
I'll build on that. I completely agree that I think one of the main problems is connecting cause to effect. Sometimes it's easy with a tool or a technique or an approach for some manager or executive to see the ROI, the immediate benefit, maybe even through some invalid metric or some measurement that is actually wrong. but it might be easier or more obvious for them to see the connection between we got this tool and this thing happened. And it might be more difficult for them to say, oh, our employees learn to be more empathetic or learn to communicate better, and how did that make or save me money? It's more difficult. It's not an A to B or A to B to C. It's often many connection points, and they're indirectly connected. I face a similar thing when trying to sell the idea of improv training. I do improv training. I have a class coming up for the Ohio State School for the Blind, where I'll be teaching a bunch of middle and high school students improv techniques. Now, the idea is that improv is just a means of teaching life skills, teaching empathy, communication, listening, questioning skills. And because it's a school course, it's easy to get in. But if you were to try and sell that to a business, they might say, okay, so if my employees become better listeners, how is that going to make or save me money? And you can walk them through the process, but it's very difficult to get that across, trying to show the ROI from some perhaps bogus metric. And I think that that's a big challenge.
Yeah, it's hard. I think it is like trying to show the ROI. I got kind of lucky. EA had a lot of soft skills classes they taught there, which I've continued to bring along with me since then, and a few from before. And just part of it is like I do them in-house myself, just so that to try and do as much as I can to improve the soft skills within our company. And they start to see the value and start to bring in, professionals or others that can teach more of those things, which is good.
So we are already running short on time. We have overrun the session. So what I'm going to do is, though there are questions coming in, Peter, Pankaj, Jim, all of you, I see your questions. We are going to send these questions to our speakers, and whatever their responses, if they are interested in responding to that question, we are going to take those and put on our blog site so you could see your responses. Does that work, speakers?
Works for me.
Yep.
Works for me too. Sounds great.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Answer.
Yes, so I will be sending these questions to you, and we could get your responses and send them across on the blog for STP site, and all the attendees can see that once the recording is up. Okay, so thank you, everyone. This concludes our webinar for today, and thank you for joining, and more importantly, thank you for being so engaging and making the most of the webinar for yourself and the group. Stay
Thank
tuned
you.
for more.
Thank you, Smita. Thanks, Angela. Thanks, Jane. Thanks, attendees.
Yes, thank you for everybody. It's been a nice hour.
Thank you. Everyone, stay tuned for more webinars and online trainings coming soon at softwaretestpro.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the upcoming webinar, which is AI Test Generation, what we learned so far on 8th of May, please go ahead and register for it. The link is already up there. The speaker is a very well-respected one on AI, that is Kevin Suresh, who is the CEO and CTO for AppFunds.ai. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week ahead. See you all in Boston in September. Yes, I talked about it. So keep practicing your communication skills. Thank you.